So to talk about Zimbabwe's current political and economic crisis, you really have to go back to the colonial era and give a little bit of historic context. So Zimbabwe was the former British colony of Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, and it gained independence in 1980. At that point, it had one president who has continued to be the same president up until the present day. That's one problem. And what happened, though, is that Zimbabwe, like much of East Africa, had a very good climate, not only for farming, but also a climate that was good for the Europeans. They could handle that climate. In West Africa, Central Africa, it was the hot tropics, basically, and a lot of disease that came with the tropical climate. It would kill the Europeans during the colonial era. So many of them chose to settle in Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and of course South Africa. So what happened is that by 1980, when Zimbabwe gained its independence, it had a large white population, and up until that point, that population had been in power. Again, very similar to South Africa, having a large majority of black Africans, but with a white minority in power. So the president, who was a black African who came into power in the 1980s, he wanted to reestablish authority and power by the black population. And so he began some initiatives that really compromised the white farmers, but in doing so also crippled the overall economy. So in the 1980s, up really until that point, they had been the breadbasket of Southern Africa and had been a very prosperous country, relatively speaking, in terms of the agriculture. But the president decided to have some land reforms to try to, again, gain that control back by the blacks. So he had land reforms that pushed the black Africans off their land, but this left a brain drain, if you will. In other words, he was putting people on the farms who didn't know how to farm, at least not in that successful, profitable sort of way. And by the 1990s and even into the early 2000s, that push only continued further and the economy continued to decline even further. So one of the main economies of agriculture was no longer a stable and well-producing economy. The other thing that was happening is that by the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, Zimbabwe was supporting a war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which also meant that they gave a lot of money for that effort. So that drained their resources. They also, by 2005, had what was called the Operation Restore Order. And this was his approach to dealing with international criticism about poverty within the country. So what happened is that because the impoverishment rate was so high, and in fact the unemployment rate in 2005 was somewhere around 85%, so staggering numbers. His response to his critics, though, was to go in and actually destroy people's homes and businesses, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, and it really obviously did not prove successful. But his goal was to accomplish two things. One was some of these people were actually his political opponents, people who were against his government. Secondly, part of the criticism had been you've got too many people living in shanty towns. And these shanty towns are where the poorest of poor live. They're people who can't buy land of their own. They find a piece of land that nobody's built anything on, and they get cardboard, bits and pieces of brick or cement, whatever they can piece together to build a house. And that's a shanty town. No electricity, no plumbing. So it's obviously a poor area. So basically he went in and bulldozed down those areas so people could say, international critics, he could point to that and say, well, I got rid of the shanty towns. But he didn't provide any sort of other alternative for these impoverished people of where they were to go. His hope is that they would go back to the farming in the rural communities. But again, there's a couple of problems with that. One is that many of them were a couple generations removed from the farms. So it'd be like asking me to go farm, which would not be successful from the suburbs, right? So they didn't have that knowledge. And secondly, there was a drought that was going on. So you've got the climate problem that was an issue. So the farms, again, were not being successful. At this time, you've also got a decrease in diamond prices in the international market, and that was another major mining resource that the country had. So all of those things really contributed. So by 2006, that's sort of the backdrop for what was happening in the country. So some of the end results of all of this, if you've got an 85 or even now 95% unemployment rate in the country, people don't have money to actually purchase anything. So the economy stalls out. There's not capital being reinvested within the country. You can't tax your citizens, right? And as much as most people don't like taxes, the problem is that a lot of our infrastructure comes from taxes. So you don't have good sewer systems, you don't have good roads, which is not only dangerous, but again, it slows down commerce because you can't trade between regions as well. You can't have good education systems. Prior to the 1990s, Zimbabwe had a really good education as well as healthcare system, and those are both in the tank now. So all of those things have really contributed to the economic crisis that happened about a decade ago, and that has continued actually in many ways to spiral downward.